Hello, my name is Manuel. I work at the sociology department at Universidad Católica in Chile, Catholic University in Chile, and I'm also affiliated at the newly launched Institute for Sustainable Development, also at Universidad Católica in Chile, and I'm here. I'm very happy to be here with Lesley Green. So why don't you introduce yourself, Lesley, and tell us a little bit about your work.
Right. Hello, I'm Lesley Green from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where I am currently the Director of Environmental Humanities South, which is a small institute, graduate research institute, where we have the privilege of working with graduates from 15 different African countries. So our work is trying to think through what fields like environmental philosophy and environmental humanities mean in a place like Africa. So I'm delighted to be in conversation with you, Manuel, because I think it's been a conversation a long time in coming, thinking around, what does it mean to work with these kinds of frames in our respective contexts, you in Latin America and myself in Africa. And certainly my experience with our students is that, I think we draw a lot and benefit hugely from these moves in theory, and yet we also have to rewrite them and rework them and rethink them. So Manuel, I mean, in the sort of work that you're doing in Latin America, in Chile in particular, what are the sort of themes that the points where you really feel that there's a critical edge in your engagement from Chile to environmental humanities and environmental philosophy?
Well, I think that maybe it is important to say that here in Chile, we are in a very special moment politically and socially and culturally. We are rewriting our constitution. So that's a huge it's a huge disruption in a good way of many frameworks and many assumptions of the social contract, right, so to speak. And I guess that's something that relates environmental humanities, or that summons what we can contribute from the environmental humanities, at least here in Chile, is how do we open up possibilities for thinking otherwise about what counts for nature and what accounts we can think about when we talk about, for example, climate change, or when we think about land, or when we think about water, which assumptions are valid when we talk about, for example, geoclimatic disruptions. What knowledges we should and we can validate to think about, right? To think about socio-ecological conflicts, and to think about extractivism, and to think about, and I'm particularly thinking about indigenous knowledges and indigenous philosophies. How can those knowledges be included in an open discussion about nature, about extractivism, about climate change, but also other community-based perspectives, knowledges, etc. I guess that's something that is interesting. That maybe because it's maybe a challenge that you face also in Africa and South Africa.
Yeah, I think that the kinds of themes that have emerged in our students' work have been really mind-blowing. to see to hear from ground level, what students have learned from places where they grew up, doing research in most instances in their home language, and the kinds of things that they have been encountering they've really, we've been going for the past 6 years now. This is our 6th year. We launched in 2015, and the kinds of themes that they've brought have really changed the way I do scholarship. They've changed the way I think, because, and I think what was so shocking for us is realizing how similar struggles are across Africa. That in Africa the struggles are against extractivism, and that what it means to be an environmentalist in Europe and what it means, and be a green person in Europe is very different to what it might mean to be. It has very different implications for living in Africa. I mean, if you are living in the DRC, in Congo, for example, and you're living in an area where there's cobalt mining, which is essential for a lot of the green tech, becoming an environmentalist in your domestic space means a totally different thing, because you're selling out in a way to, if you for example, in titanium mining in the east coast of South Africa, titanium is potentially a huge game changer for solar panels. It's used to make light airplane wings. It's which is an energy saver, fuel saver, and yet what it means to people who live there is the loss of farmland, all in the name of development. And so it becomes a really complicated matter to think about what it means to be an environmentalist in these kinds of contexts. So I was really fascinated to read the work that you and your team had done on the Anthropocene, on responding to the Anthropocene. And I wondered if you wanted to just give a quick overview of that, because I think it would be really interesting for students.
Sure. Yeah, we've been thinking about the Anthropocene for a while now. First, trying to open up the field or the reflection around the Anthropocene to multiple disciplines to start with. So to make a meeting between geology, but also anthropology, biology, but also sociology, etc. The arts are very important in this mix. So we've been doing this kind of experiments in which we get together and we think together about the Anthropocene. That has been really rewarding in many ways. And also we've been thinking, and I've been thinking, particularly in the last couple of years, about how to talk about the Anthropocene without naming the Anthropocene. Because the name, the notion of the Anthropocene comes with a lot of baggage, right? And we in the critical social sciences, and you, Lesley, has been a key figure. We've been really critical to the Anthropocene as a concept, right? We want to deconstruct the Anthropocene, but maybe it's time to think otherwise and to think about the connection between the geological and the social in other ways, right? I mean, to account for that connection, that is really, we are in the need for doing research and doing critical thinking about how the social on the one hand and the geological on the other, how they meet, how they interact, and what's the role of capitalism and colonialism in that connection, right? Um, but I've been thinking how to account for that in other ways. For example, I've been doing a lot of work with indigenous communities in northern Chile, with the Licanantay communities, Atacameño communities, and for them, the separation between the social and the geological does not make sense. And that's a huge assumption for the Anthropocene, right? For the concept of the Anthropocene. I mean, the assumption is that you have two realms that are separated, the geological and the social, and they interact, right? But they are two separated realities. But when you have, for example, but when for you a mountain is a grandfather, for example.
Yes.
When a river is kin, is family, how can you separate the geological from the social? I mean, it's not. I mean, you can, but not always. And that's been really interesting for me to think about the Anthropocene. I mean, what other ways to think about the concept may exist?
So, I mean, this is a really key thing for, in one of your papers, your paper Lithic Abstractions, in the abstract you talk about engaging with geopoetics. And it's so interesting to read the sort of work that you've been doing, because clearly you're looking for a way of engaging with colleagues in the natural sciences. And we're working towards a paradigm shift. And yet that conversation is so difficult to find, because even a word like Anthropocene is so very difficult to use, because it already means what you don't want it to mean when you're trying to describe the era that we are in. It already brings and mobilizes a whole lot of ideas that one is trying to get away from. So in terms of then grappling with its erasure of capital and capitalism, and its erasure of extractivism as a particular practice, and its erasure of knowledges. So, it's erased so much before we've even started the conversation. So I was really intrigued by your concept of geopoetics. How do you use that? How could you use that in your engagements with colleagues in the sciences?
Well, that's an excellent question, and actually I wanted to ask you something similar about your book, but let me just say that I think that it's quite important to find. I mean, if we want to experiment with other knowledges, with other disciplines, with other traditions, I think we need to invent another language.
Yeah, I'm so with you on that.
Right? I mean, like I cannot design or set up a table that is generous and that is engaging for everyone if I impose my own lexicon, if I impose my own grammar.
Right.
So what is interesting is that the way in that particular paper, the way I use geopoetics comes from the geologists themselves.
Yeah.
That they find in what they call geopoetics, right? But basically, they find in the ways they approach nature from a more affective perspective, right? They find there a space that can be shared and that can be like a meeting ground for everyone. And I think that's beautiful, and I think that we should learn from that, and it kind of like a more generative we should take that as an invitation to find new languages, more affective languages, to meet, to encounter.
Right.
And that's something that I really liked about your book, actually, Lesley. Your book, which for those that don't know, It's called Rock, Water, Life, Ecology, and Humanities for a Decolonial South Africa. Because one of the really beautiful things about your book, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that, is the way it is written. Especially the introduction. I think it has this kind of more narrative prose that even in ethnographic accounts, it's not usual to find that kind of beautiful, more friendly in a way, kind of writing, that prose that is so caring and it is so with so many images. So maybe you have been exploring also with geopoetics and your own work, and of course your engagement with Aimé Césaire and other poets.
Well, thanks, Manuel. You know, that mode of writing actually came out of working with students through the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall era. You know, you can imagine, what is it to start to talk about environment in South Africa, which is a country that for more than 100 years has separated, 80%, to put a rough figure on it, of its people from land. The 1913 Land Act separated Black South Africans from the land. And so it's, no surprises that Indigenous knowledge in South Africa has survived really in the fields where it's mobile. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that in Latin America or North America even, Indigenous knowledge is very land-based, it's place-based. But here, the surviving modalities of Indigenous knowledge are mobile. They're law, Ubuntu as a philosophy, ethical, moral, legal philosophy, and medical knowledge. So it's knowledge that survives in the body. And there's been a tremendous loss of knowledge in relation to land and ecologies. There's very little surviving knowledge of ecology. And so what does it mean to work with students and think about what does it mean to be an environmentalist? How can you ask students to even begin to engage with modalities of environmentalism that don't recognize the trauma and the alienation of forced land loss for generations, 4 or 5 generations or more? I had to think very hard about my teaching practice in that time. I mentioned it at some point in the book that I realized that in those classes, Black students weren't interested in more white tears, more white shame about whiteness or whatever one's ancestors have gotten up to. But what they needed was, and valued, was my presence. And that meant being present to my own history, to my own family's history. And so when it came to writing a book and trying to find a way to introduce a different way of thinking about environmentalism, it was really, I needed to speak from the soles of my feet, as it were. I needed to speak from where I was, from where I am, from where I live. And at that time I was doing a lot of cycling, and just seeing the way that the land fitted together without disciplines. How do we approach the world without disciplines, without the disciplinary knowledges? It was really valuable to be able to try to just think through each landscape. Okay, I'm cycling through this landscape. What else is going on here? What between the different species and the different histories, the erased presences that are here, and to try to rethink environment in relation to all the many erased presences seemed to me to be the only way I could honestly and ethically engage landscape. And so it became quite personal. And I was most intrigued to engage with a troll on social media who has obviously read my introduction and told me that I needed mental help, quote.
Really?
Yeah. So and I just thought, well, that's interesting, because clearly this is a person who situates himself politically in a white space, not necessarily a white person, but and I thought that was actually quite a valuable thought, that quite a valuable comment, because it meant that I was speaking to a space of uncomfortability outside of what it means to be white, and but I think also, for me, and this is why I'm really interested in your thinking with poetics, is the modalities of thinking and the modalities of speaking that we've inherited in the university are so they come with such a brutal history, and so it's really interesting to me that your work engages both poetics and different knowledges and extractivism, because I think there's something very powerfully synergistic in that with the kind of work that we find ourselves doing in Africa, even though we are reading the environmental humanities books that don't come from this context, and they don't necessarily surface those issues in that way, perhaps with the exception of Rob Nixon and his book Slow Violence. But what does it mean to read that environmental humanities literature in a context like this, of violent extractivism, of erased knowledges, of a colonial heritage, and of a university where teaching practice for so long has made it a site of alienation, and how do we reclaim a mode of speaking and thinking about environment that addresses that alienation? That for me is central. So trying to write a book like that meant having to try to reinvent the rhetoric of engagement, or the poetics of engagement. So it felt like a strange compliment to be told that clearly I needed mental help for writing in that way. Yeah.
No, but
yeah.
No, I just wanted to say that you can see and feel that in your book, and that's really amazing, and that's really great. Trying to open up the mode of thinking and writing and expressing, and yes, and how that is also kind of a political statement about how to think about environments.
Right.
That's great. Yeah, that's amazing.
I mean, Amitav Ghosh, the title of his book, The Great Derangement, says it all, as only a novelist can in 3 words. The Great Derangement. We have inherited the derangement, and the university is part of that derangement. Our modes of thinking are part of that.
Absolutely.
So how do we destabilize that?
Yeah.
So I want to take you back to your approach to this geopoetics. You said something that I wanted to ask you about. You said that some of the geopoetics comes from your engagements with geologists. And I was curious as to, could you give us an example of the way that they would use that geopoetics?
So yes, two examples. One is when you spend time with them in the field, when when you go with them to do field work, something that I've done and that I really appreciate and that I really love to go out with them. They are constantly talking about their matters of concern. They're always talking about volcanoes and about rocks, and talking about like phreatic waters. They are always talking about those objects, those matters, in a very caring and a very lovingly way. uh, they are very keen, they are very affectively attached to those matters, right? So they will usually talk about those matters as persons, for example, uh, and, and of course they are always, they are scientists, right? So they have all their equipment and they have all their you know, like scientific devices, and they perform a way of doing like Western science, and they are also very keen on representing that way of thinking, right? But on the other hand, maybe unwittingly, they are always treating these matters in a very, with a lot of love, with a lot of care, as friends, as things that matter, and they talk about their love for volcanoes, and they ask permission to climb a mountain, or to, you know, to dig into a glacier. There's all this kind of, and then they use, they talk in a way that is very poetic about their matters of concern. That's one way. And the other way in which actually one person talked to me explicitly about geopoetics is that in geology, they are not able to do experimentation as the way the modern sciences, the experimental modern sciences do, right? They cannot experiment because they deal with things that have happened thousands of millions of years ago, right? And things that are completely out of reach. You cannot experiment with volcanic magma, right? It's humanly impossible. So what they do, how they engage with things that are out of reach and even out of imagination. How can you imagine something that happens 50 kilometers down below the earth, right? So they are always inventing ways, scientific ways of imagining, of representing, and of kind of they are inventing stories about what happened, right? So for example, one geologist, she told me, what we do is that we see a mountain, where a cordillera, right? We see like a mountain range, and we have to reconstruct retrospectively. We have to invent a story that makes sense for the formation of that mountain, of that cordillera, right? But that story that they have to invent, she told me, is a geopoetics, because we don't know. We are inventing. We have to come out with a sensitive account for how that mountain range was formed. So it's very speculative. She told me, we are speculating, and that's amazing, right? We have to speculate about what happened. We have to invent a story, and for her, that was a kind of is doing poetics about and with the geological, right? And I thought that was really, really beautiful and interesting, especially because we think about the natural sciences and the earth sciences and as these people which are completely outside critique, right? They are unable to do reflexivity because they are so engaged in Western colonial sciences. But when you are with them, you realize that there are many instances, moments, fissures in which we can actually learn how to do critique with them instead of despite them, right?
Yeah, no, that's such an interesting point. So many interesting points. One is rethinking critique as the modality of useful engagement with the sciences, something that I'm really trying to think about. The second is this issue of poetics, and coming back to that, I suppose the two connect, but I'm really intrigued at the similarity between speculative writing and modeling. Both are concerned with predicting the future. So speculative fiction comes to replace science fiction and imagining what is likely. And when we're asked to do work alongside our colleagues in the natural sciences to think about likely futures in relation to their models, if we to do social sciences alongside the models, it's okay, well, what would that imply if a temperature goes into such a thing, and that has this impact on the rainfall, and that impact on the available plant species, which is going to in turn have this impact on, you're following these cascading effects. You realize the extent to which modeling and speculative fiction, speculative writing are very, very, they're both speculative. They both make particular assumptions and trying to find, so it becomes a very interesting space. Of course, you're talking about the past, speculative pasts, which of course also has its parallel in paleobotany. I'm trying to think around the old form styles of landscapes. But we have a student at the moment who's really trying to use these kinds of approaches to say, well, what happens to a particular molecule, for example? And so in much the same way as I remember in the 1990s reading a story about an AK-47 rifle getting manufactured in East Germany, shipped out to Cuba, taken across the Atlantic Ocean to Angola in Southern Africa, getting captured by the South African Defence Force in their war in what is now Namibia, was Southwest Africa, coming through to South Africa, then getting secretly traded across to the rebel forces in Mozambique, which the apartheid government was supporting, and then being used to oppose the socialists in Mozambique, and then finding its way back into South Africa, and being used in crime, and sort of the stories around a particular weapon, and so to think, for example, about the stories you could tell about particular molecules, that have come. Let's think of lithium, for example. It comes from Chile, goes to Europe as part of a green revolution, but part of a battery, for someone's car, which is, then part of the green, and so at various moments that molecule is part of a profound extractivism. Then it gets, which is very environmentally destructive, gets sold and marketed as a molecule for the greens, and then becomes waste and finds its way back into the ocean and into fish, and becomes another environmental problem. So, these kinds of speculative modes of writing are very, very useful in trying to reconstitute an environmentalism that isn't a simplistic environmentalism that presumes there to be a green environmentalism and an anti-environmentalism, but it just problematizes that.
Well, there's one thing that I've been thinking a lot, and it's great that you brought up that you are brought it up here, is the issue about extractivism.
Yeah.
Not only as a territorially based phenomena, right? But also as an analytics for thinking the histories, the trajectories of lands and people and rivers and waters, and the political histories of our
Yeah.
places, right? Both South Africa and Chile and Latin America and Africa at large. And because I think, I don't know what are your thoughts, Lesley, but my sense, maybe you don't agree or maybe you do, but that while in North America, for example, and Europe, especially North America, I'm thinking about Canada and the US, the critical concepts to think these other modes of knowing, or to engage with, for example, indigenous ways of doing and moral philosophies, are the concepts of climate change, or even the Anthropocene. It is in Latin America and Africa. I mean, in Latin America and Africa, at least in Latin America, we don't talk much. Communities are not really engaged in the issue of climate change as such, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they are very, I mean, here I work with communities in which the issues of climate change are very, 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 very severe, right? Are dramatic, and they are really worried, and they are mobilizing against, water depletion, or etc., right? But as a concept, climate change is not very present. But the issue of extractivism is really the key notion around which action is mobilized or organized, and discourse is articulated. And I see a similarity with Africa there. So what do you think about extractivism as a concept and as a reality?
I think it's absolutely central, and I'm so glad you've honed in on that, because it also goes to the question of how do you engage with colleagues in the natural sciences, and I think that where climate change is the central focus, one tends to lose the kinds of struggles, the ecological, eco-political struggles that are going on the ground, and I think that a lot of the climate change mechanisms that have been designed as global politics continue to erase precisely the modalities of north-south relations that have been so destructive in the past, and so much of the climate change approaches fail to recognize the status quo as central to the problem. And when we're talking status quo, we mean everything that goes from between extractivism to the consumer, and then of course onto the waste dump. And so much of the climate change language still is happening in the world of consumption. It's become centrally focused on ethical consumption, and it's not looking so much on waste dumps, and it's barely looking at all at extractives. So trying to find a way to shift that is key, and it's so helpful and interesting to hear that in Latin America too, there's not really a very strong engagement with climate change, because I think here climate change is overwhelmingly seen as a northern concern, and certainly in the dominant neoliberal political discourses, which are, simply put, the spaces of oligarchy and the new feudalism. They rest on the continuation of extractivism, and they create this discourse of its either environment or its development, which is a false dialectic, it's a false polemic, but it's very persuasive, and battles get fought where people die in we must have development because we need economic benefits in this area, versus no, we cannot have that development because we need to be able to farm and grow grow food. But it's a false polemic. There's been very little uptake apart on climate. There isn't a climate movement to speak of in South Africa. There's small pockets of Extinction Rebellion here and there, perhaps in Joburg, and perhaps to a lesser extent here in Cape Town. But for me, to think with environmentalism in Africa means to think about land. And to think about land means you need to be engaging with extractivism, the theft of land and colonial theft of land and the ongoing land grabbing and water grabbing. And that includes, it includes all the usual suspects, but it also includes, relations with China, and the way the Chinese politics is playing out in Africa in terms of buying up farmland and buying up water rights, creating new railways which would become new conduits of extraction. I'm sure you've seen that cartoon of but it's Latin America and Africa hollowed out with these piles of coins in all over the north. It's that famous cartoon, which I think sums up the issue. But I think that the global climate discussions have been overwhelmingly framed by big capital.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And so the premises of them are on keeping consumption going. REDD Plus, for example. I spoke to a climate scientist about REDD Plus, the REDD meaning the reduction of emissions, deforestation, and degradation, which is one of the major climate negotiation pillars of global climate, carbon emissions management, which basically allows a polluter in the north to keep on polluting, but paying exactly. Communities in the south not to cut down their forests. That worries me greatly because you're not actually requiring any behavior change from the polluters. And you're potentially setting up a really violent and unsustainable set of political relations around a forest, which people would have lived around for a very long time. So, and certainly in the research that our students have been doing, it's come to light in the course of that research that REDD Plus agreements are really not effective on the ground. And on the contrary, by financializing relationships with the forest, you end up, it seems from the research that I've been seeing coming out in Congo and in Mozambique, you end up perpetuating, or not even perpetuating, you end up initiating really destructive forms of relation with forests that ultimately, as it seems to me, may well be contributing to deforestation in the end, as people realize that this is a forest that can be financialized. So I think that an approach that looks at extractivism is something that really does need to be foregrounded as a Southern engagement with global climate negotiations.
And I guess that one of the things that I appreciate about extractivism as a framework for thinking our environmentalism is what you are saying, right? I mean, that extractivism foregrounds the colonial and capitalist basis of environmental degradation and damage, right? But I also think that one of the key contributions of extractivism as a concept, right, is that it foregrounds kind of the indivisibility, the entwinement between the geological, whether it's lands or mountains or rivers or valleys, and bodies. Because one interesting thing about extractivism is that it is situated. It situates damage in specific places, in specific communities that suffer in very particular ways and very concrete ways. It's not abstraction. When you talk about suffering, for example, there is cobalt mining somewhere in South Africa. It's concrete suffering. It's not an abstract, it's not an abstract increase of temperature. Right? And so by reading that situation from the lens of extractivism, you are able to render visible the kind of, the entwinment between, you are able to rethink or problematize what a body means. A body is not only human, it's also, you cannot separate in a body what is human and what is geological.
Right.
When you harm a mountain, you're all at the same time, you're harming the metabolisms of your human body.
Right.
And that's something that, like communities here in Latin America and in Chile have been really, really vocal about that. That it is impossible to separate between different realms. It is impossible to separate between bodily harm to myself as a body and harm to a mountain. We are together. We are with the mountain. And of course, this is something that indigenous philosophies have very clearly stated for millennia, right?
Right.
So that, I think, is something that we should, that's something that offers the concept of extractivism, that kind of disrupts the modern divide between nature and culture. That is really interesting, and it is happening in the public sphere when communities mobilize, for example, against mining, because it's not just about climate change. It's not only about carbon emissions. It's not only about water depletion. It's also like you are harming life. You're harming our vitalities, and that, I think, it's really powerful.